Hello and welcome to the monthly Central U.S. Climate Outlook. My name is John Ives with the National Weather Service Central Region Headquarters in Kansas City. I will be today's moderator. Just to let you know, we have muted everyone's line to keep it nice and clear so everyone may enjoy the full benefit of the call. Thank you. Our speaker today is Nolan Doskin. He is from Colorado State University and is the Colorado State climatologist. Following the briefing, we will open the lines to take questions, or if you have a question along the way, you may also post it in the question part of the GoToWebinar software. So let's go ahead and turn it over to Nolan. Nolan?
Okay, this is my maiden voyage as host here. I guess I'm not host, I'm presenter. And we'll see where we go with this. We'll start with a good view of harvest in progress, and that is certainly the case this year, and there's been a lot of clear skies lately. As usual, here's the background information for the collaborative activity documentation, how we're all working together here to make this information possible. Remember, there'll be another monthly webinar coming up the week before Thanksgiving, and they're all available online. More to come. All right, what are we going to cover today? Aha, I think we're not on the Great Plains anymore. We must be in Colorado. We're going to talk a little bit about our background climate, the expectations for what fall and the whole annual cycle is like. That gives us a little better feel for where we're sitting today. Then we'll do our normal review of climatic conditions as we've experienced them in the last month. We'll talk a little bit about impacts, and then why many of you come in to the calls. You're very interested in what might be coming next. We'll talk about that at the end. Let's go. Here's our climate background. We're now in the middle of October. This is the 30-year normal, 1981 through 2010, of average October daily high temperatures. And you'll see by the time we're into October, the north-south latitude gradient across the Great Plains and Midwest is what drives climatic differences. You head out to our part of the country, and latitude matters, but altitude matters most. And then you see the little spike of warmth that goes up the lee side of the Rockies all the way into Montana and all the way up to Calgary and Edmonton as well. That's part of the Great Plains climate that we're a part of. I just brought a few little temperature curves here from different parts of our region. The warm one on that graph is the average annual temperatures through the year using the October through September calendar for Evansville, Indiana, southern Indiana. We work our way up to Peoria, then Minneapolis, then Fargo, and then we come out west to Billings and to Denver, Colorado. And you'll see, again, evidence of that Chinook effect on the lee side of the Rockies, where latitude controls the temperature for the others, getting colder as you go north. But then as you get close to the mountains, we get that warm protection in midwinter. And it's interesting to see there that Denver and Evansville aren't that much different for mean temperature when you're in midwinter. Let's look at precipitation. Now we're in the land of the east-west gradient across the Great Plains from the Midwest. And the farther west you go, the drier it gets on average. Yes, there's exceptions at times in individual storms, but that's the overriding climate that we live in. Let's look at those same set of stations and what their average monthly precipitation for the water year is. And again, we're 15 days into the new 2016 water year. October, November, and then all of these stations reach their minimum for the year in January and February before the big spring ramp up. You'll see the closer to the mountains and then farther north you get, the drier winters are. But again, winter precipitation still exceeds evaporative demand in most areas, so it's still a recharge season that we're heading into. All right. And I just wanted you to know, I use this graph in many talks I give in Colorado to lower the expectations of what the climatologist really has to offer by saying, indeed, no 2 years are ever the same. That's 120 years of real data from one of our stations. In there is a nice smooth average, but that's the reality of the variability month to month and year to year that we see. Let's look at how the temperatures have progressed during this last year, because those smooth curves I showed you are nice guides to how things differ from place to place, but in fact it plays out on a daily basis. That's where the daily impacts occur, and that shows us that onset of extreme cold we had last fall in November, and then bursts of cold in the end of the calendar year, end of February, then the remarkably warm start to the spring, and then the fact that temperatures didn't rise much from early March all the way to the end of May. We were near steady state as the normals rise, but the actuals didn't. We were in that cool, wet May period. Then a very pleasant summer, and only here recently have we been in a warm anomaly starting in early, well, actually at the end of August, and then progressing most of the last 6 weeks on the warm side consistently. Let's take a Midwestern location. There's Moline for the same 12 months of the 2015 water year. You'll see there the progression a little bit different. The November cold wave, harsh nevertheless, and likewise the late February cold wave, very dramatic. Then you again see a summer of fairly pleasant temperatures, some high humidities to go with that, however, at times. And then you see the warm, general warm trend later on here in September, and I didn't continue that graph into early October. So let's review where we stand now. For the last month, the September temperatures way above average everywhere across our whole region. The only places close to average for the month of September were up near the Canadian border in north central Montana. The largest warm anomaly, north central Kansas, with 8 to 10 degree above average for a whole month. That's pretty big for this time of year. That is a widespread warm anomaly. Looking at it nationally, we had the bulk of the warmth for the country, but not all of it. And in fact, if you look on a national time scale, September 2015 for the country, contiguous 48 states, second warmest on record, and not too many like it in recorded history. And you'll see we have been running an interesting September fall warming trend over the course of the last couple decades. In terms of rankings of our September temperatures, warmest on record for several of the states, all the upper Great Lakes states, and here in Colorado as well, and everyone else was darn close. You have to get to the southeast and the Pacific Northwest to be more near the middle of the distribution. If we just look at our last 30 days, the upper left is the actual, the lower right is the departure from average, and again the warm anomaly has continued to persist throughout these first 2 weeks of the month. And if we look at just the last 7 days, now we have a really impressive set of anomalies where we have stations as much as 15 degrees above average for the last week. And in fact, we had some daily records set on Sunday that were as much as 10 to 12 degrees above the previous daily record for that date. That's an impressive outlier. Oh, here's some of them right now. Here's some of the records set in, these look like all Nebraska stations, but we have several of them broke previous records by 8 to 10 degrees. Most impressive. Have you noticed, many of us on the call have not yet had our first fall freeze. Only parts of the eastern Dakotas, northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, the UP of Michigan. Here, even on the Front Range of the Rockies, we haven't come close. Our lowest temperatures have been in the low 40s so much. Normally, let's see, we're in that, what color are we in? There's the color that we're in. And this is where the freeze of this time of year, down in the mid-October time frame. The freeze is usually well in the past as we get farther north. But just so you know, the freeze is coming. There's the forecast for the next couple days where sub-freezing temperatures are expected over several of the plain states. Now let's talk about precipitation. That's a cloud that hasn't been around here much lately. We've been cloudless for several days. Just wanted to point out an interesting event about a week after the last webinar back in September, when a plume of tropical moisture worked its way up, starting in the Arizona, New Mexico region, and then by the morning of the 23rd, it laid down some precipitation across much of eastern Nebraska. Then it maximized and it slowed down. It did send a little plume up to western Lake Superior, the Duluth area, but dumped upwards of 10 inches in a 2 to 3 day period over eastern Omaha area into the Council Bluffs area. That was really quite a dumper. Many other parts just to the immediate west and east were getting nothing while that storm sat and dumped for a couple of days. And then it rounded out. And again, we were setting the precursor conditions there in the Carolinas, which is not our concern today, but already there in late September, we were getting rains right on the same drainages of the Carolinas that got flooded here a couple of weeks after that. Looking at precip for September as a whole, expressed as a percent of average as usual, speckled here and there, but with the biggest wet anomalies being eastern Nebraska, far west and southwest Iowa, and then up in the northern North Dakota area, also the Duluth area, also the Champaign-Urbana, my home county, and other areas very, very dry, such as Wyoming, Missouri, etc. September precip rankings, fairly middle of the distribution. On the dry side, Colorado, Kansas, and Missouri. On the wet side, where those heavy rains fell in Nebraska. If we look at the water year and the calendar year and look at the rankings, then we're seeing we're still running one of the top 10 percentiles for areas south of our region, Texas, Oklahoma, and in fact southern Missouri and Kentucky. But as we get farther north, much more near the middle of the distribution. Just looking at the last 30 days as a departure from average, again, you see that eastern Nebraska, southwest Iowa anomaly on the wet side, but other areas, Missouri in particular, on the dry side. And that leaves a soil moisture anomaly map as we end the growing season and are deep into the harvest season, that's showing quite a bit of areas have been drying out, but still wet pockets lingering, not an extreme anomaly at this point for most areas. Let's look at the evolution of drought or lack thereof. As we started the growing season, we were concerned about dryness. As we went into April, that dryness was really quite rapidly expanding. Began to retreat quickly, however, in May. And by the middle of June, excess moisture was a much bigger problem than lack thereof. And in fact, the vast majority of the National Weather Service Central Region area, with the exception of southern Indiana and Kentucky, were largely drought-free, just little pockets, and most of that was long-term lingering as opposed to short-term impacts. July, even less area, although it was creeping then into western Montana and the upper Missouri. And by August, again, made it through August, almost drought-free, quite a pleasant thing for the Midwest to do. And by September, a little more dryness starting to show up. Our part of the country, west, northeast Colorado, northwest Kansas, southwest Nebraska, and then by our latest drought monitor update issued this morning, you'll see not severe, but short-term dryness on a number of places scattered throughout the area. Let's talk impacts. And I'm happy to say not too much, other than that this last weekend was a little bit ugly. Those hellacious winds blowing across eastern Montana, the Dakotas, and extreme warmth fueled a number of wildfires, Dakotas in particular, although we got some. Southern Wyoming had a few. We had several fires burning, almost all grass fires as opposed to forest fires. And those horses looked quite content, all things considered, since their pasture had just been burned just the day previous. But overall, fires this time of year with passages of dry fronts, not uncommon. We've had plenty of dry grass this year, thanks to the wet May, June time period that we had in much of our area. We've had rapid late season drying, low humidities here recent, and of course as we change into the fall season, we've had more episodes of wind and low humidity air. So it's not surprising. We've had quite a few red flag warnings, mostly northern plains, Wyoming, Montana. Overall fire problem, not as bad as it could be. Still more moisture in the fuels than sometimes this year, but still a problem. Let's talk autumn foliage, just because we have the chance to, and I have to show pictures. I could show more. Our season has been progressing fairly normally, even with the dry and warm temperatures. We're still losing colors and leaves at the higher altitudes. It's just a crude map nationally of where we stand with the near peak. Oh man, these are not my favorite colors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is that the near peak? Yep. Near peak in some of our areas moving into the southern Great Lakes, past peak at the high altitudes of the Rockies and in the northern Great Lakes. And I love going tree watching in the valleys of the South Platte. It's actually more beautiful than you might think. And there's the current status as of anticipation for going into this weekend. Let's talk about Great Lakes. I visit Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, Lake Huron almost every year. I was there this year. Surface temperatures, after having had a darn cold water temperature year in 2014 and pretty cool in 2015, now have been approaching more normal temperatures. In fact, I think a graph I show momentarily will actually take us above the average for this time of year. Lake levels dropping, which is the normal cycle for this time of year, but they're still high, especially with respect to where they had been most of the last decade, but particularly 2011 to 2013. Let's look at some data. All right, there we're looking Lake Superior on the left, Lake Michigan on the right. The smooth curve, not unexpectedly, being the average, and the more erratic being the actual observed. And you'll see we are ending, thanks to the warm late September, October. We are on the warm side, haven't had a lot of winds to bring up deeper waters yet, but there we are having, and then by comparison, we have had some markedly hotter temperatures, 2010, 2011, 2012, and then some markedly colder temperatures last year. So where are we on this busy graph? I guess here we are. Still pretty warm for this late in the season, again, because of the recent warmth and lack of strong overturning winds. Lake Michigan running a fairly similar pattern, doesn't have quite the range of variability as Superior at this observing point. Look at Great Lakes water levels, the Huron-Michigan combination versus Lake Superior have a lot in common, but not totally. And there was our rapid increase in 2013 and even higher in 2014 without, on Lake Huron, Michigan system, barely dropped last winter, which is quite uncommon. That's a full, well, almost a 2-foot rise in one season or 1 year. Still high, but on the way down. These are the range of projections going forward. Quite a range of possibilities, but best estimate is we will stay on the high side. If you've spent time on the shoreline of any of the Great Lakes, it was fascinating to see that after these prolonged low water levels, that vegetation had made its way towards the water line, and beaches this year were very narrow. Very hard to find good places to play on the sand because there was so little room between vegetation and water. That doesn't take very long to change, but that was an unusual anomaly this year. Did you know, anybody want to sing along with me, the Gordon Lightfoot song? Anyway, we're coming up on the 40th anniversary, only less than 4 weeks from now, of the last Great Lakes freighter to go down, the Edmund Fitzgerald. Will the gales of November come early this year? I don't think they knew they were coming in 75, at least not 4 weeks in advance, but November is a big storm month on the Great Lakes, so it's something you have to keep in mind. Let's look at water levels a little bit on the rivers, just showing you. I looked at Dennis Toddy's briefing from April, of which the anticipation was, yeah, the water will be coming up, but not a high likelihood of flooding. But that was particularly as it applied to the Rocky Mountain portion of the basins. But in fact, with the amazing May, June precipitation, we had high water for a prolonged period of time on the South Platte, the North Platte, and on into the Missouri River system from mostly rain, not so much snowmelt. There's our South Platte River still before it leaves Colorado, east of the Front Range, where we spent about a month at or near flood stage, alternating in and out of flood conditions as not so much snowmelt, although this last portion was snow peaks. This last one was a rain peak. Most of this were rain peaks, not snowmelt, which was quite interesting for a normally snowmelt-driven system, although we are prone to occasional widespread spring low-elevation rains. Where do we stand this week? Our 7-day average stream flow from thanks to the USGS, you're seeing mostly near normal and above normal colors over the majority of the Midwest Great Plains, Missouri Basin area until you get headwaters of the Missouri. As you get northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula area, and as you get areas of Kansas that have still suffered from persistent multi-year drought. Overall, stream flows, surface water supplies have held up really pretty well, even with the recent dryness. Most watersheds performing okay. We're returning to base flow coming out of the Rockies, but that's totally normal. You may know of some impacts, but they haven't found their way to me. Mostly pretty good, all things considered. Let's talk ag. I can't pretend to be a Midwestern ag climatologist, although that was my background, but I've been in the Rocky Mountains too long with more focus on the irrigation water side and less on the crop side. But I will say the weather we've had recently, I have not been hearing a whole lot of complaints until the dry winds and wildfires, and we've even had some cornfield fires here recently. That's not pleasant, but for the most part, it's been great. More disadvantages, take that back, more advantages than disadvantages from the mild, dry weather as we move into fall. Crops have matured nicely, even those that got off to a late start. Harvest not only underway, but well underway, and grain drying has been happening very nicely, naturally in the field. So the current projections are that less drying will be needed than usual. No early freezes. We've gotten reports of just fantastic crop years for places like Minnesota, northern Iowa. Minnesota, the corn king of the year, some incredible yields and also quite a bit of acreage. Illinois, I am sorry about those pie pumpkins. Did I leave something out of the spelling? I don't remember. Anyway, the area where much of the pie pumpkin for canning occurs had really took it on the chin from that September or May, June, particularly June, late wet weather. And I think I'll show you a graph momentarily. And they did not see recovery. So use your own pies for your pumpkin this year maybe, or expect to pay more. 2016 winter wheat crop being planted, but a little shaky start so far. They don't so much like the prolonged dry, warm weather. Great to get planting in, but they were planting into dry surfaces to begin with. Interesting that usually no-till is a plus for soil moisture, but it's not always a plus for germination because you have to plant fairly shallow, and there's decent soil moisture farther down still, but not in the near surface. We're seeing some pretty marginal early emergence from what was planted. Some of the wheat growers have held off, but now they're going ahead and planting, doing what's called dusting it in, planting it into soil that was not moist enough to germinate seed, but is hopeful that it will come along later. Oh yeah, that's the pie pumpkin relative graph, accumulated precipitation at a location in Illinois, Peoria, and just showing you just how dramatic and persistent that weather was from the beginning of June on into early July that just kept things from happening there. Great sense, but if you didn't get started when you needed to, you were in trouble. Let's talk a little bit more about wheat. 2015 crop came out okay, and again, Colorado's a big wheat state, so we pay more attention to that. We grow as much corn as we can, but we're a net corn importer, not exporter, for our cattle feeding operations here. Soil moisture has been coming up short here at planting time. We've been seeing late spotty emergence, as I said before. Temperature pushing water demand high on those that have gotten emergence, but also drying the soil surface really very rapidly. Iffy now, lots of things that can go wrong, but as we see year in and year out, wheat is remarkably resilient, has many chances to recover. Lots of things have to go bad to lose it all the way around. There's winter wheat acres. We've had an update for 2015 here with new statistics I just wanted to showing the planted versus harvested for U.S. as a whole. The yield, both this year for a different set of reasons, there's my cursor, than last year, but both distinctly lower wheat yields compared to the trend line, nevertheless better than any wheat yields prior to the mid-90s. That's a heck of a trend. And there's wheat production, overall production, yield times acres coming in a little low, all things considered. Outlooks. Now, that's what you've been waiting for. I always wait till the end and hope maybe we'll run out of time. Quickly looking at 7-day, 8 to 14. We'll look at November. We'll talk El Nino. We'll wrap it up. Next 7 days, most of our area is not going to get much moisture, but there is a storm system coming out of the southwest. California, Arizona already getting moisture coming in. It's expected to get our part of the country and then send a storm up out of Texas, Oklahoma, and catching a slowing upper level system will slow it down, put down a little more widespread over the Great Lakes. But for the plains as a whole, little moisture, but for some of the wheat belt, not that much. We'll see how this plays out. Temperature projections and precipitation projections going out 2 weeks. The warm anomaly that's been over the west and has been verifying pretty well, shifting eastward for this 1 week period, and much of the country has a little better than 50-50 chances, not super high confidence, but some confidence of being on the wet side for week 2. Going out to November now, you're starting to see the inklings of the fork of the El Nino type signal with warmth to the north, maybe cool to the south, and maybe wet to the south. The projection of a wet fall has been with us for several months, and the wet fall has not materialized for Colorado, West Kansas yet. We're holding on and watching for this next one. How about El Nino? Alive and well. Is it as impressive a looking a graph as it was in 82, 83 and 97, 98? Maybe not yet, but it's in terms of magnitude as of this point in time, it is high and still going up. There's our sea surface temperature anomalies still showing the El Nino strongly in place, and as the warm anomalies very much in the El Nino regions, and then extending on up the coast of Central America, and in fact all the way up into the U.S. as well. Projections on that are to still probably keep going up. Well, these are how some of the other ones have played out of the stronger El Nino. Some of them waited till the late winter to maximize. Some maximize a little earlier. We'll see. The projections, that was the top one, shows what was projected this spring, and it's materialized reasonably well as projected near the middle of the spaghetti plots. Here's the more recent spaghetti plots showing the December peak and then the likely rapid decrease, but still staying in El Nino territory above the 1 degree C threshold into the late winter, early spring months. That's important. Whether if staying here versus here does affect the probability of some of the impacts. And there's the most recent round of the Plume ENSO model projections. Again, most likely peak a couple months out from now. We do some statistics for Colorado, just looking at likelihoods for each season of different anomalies. If you're in the middle of that distribution, 50%, and have your values scattered on either side, which is what the spring projections are for our northern mountains. That is essentially the flip a coin, but for our northern mountains, high probability of wet in the early part of winter and late fall, high probability of dry midwinter with no exceptions for any of the strong El Niños. And this is why the projection for the upper Missouri Basin is also on the dry side, is this projects upward into Missouri, into Montana and Wyoming as well. But we go to southwest Colorado, and yes, you think you get to the south and you have a high probability of being wet. Well, it turns out the odds are tilted towards wet, but not by no means are they all there, except where we only have one exception of dry falls when we're in strong El Nino mode. We haven't done these sorts of graphics for all areas. This is all compliments of Klaus Walter and the folks at the Western Water Assessment in Boulder. Let's just look at what those 3-month outlooks look like. We're looking, as you've seen before, no big surprises. These are the new outlooks that came out this morning. Warm is the most likely outcome for the northern plains and upper Great Lakes. Equal chances in the central plains and in our part of the Rocky Mountain chain, and then thinking cool as you get into the Texas, New Mexico, Louisiana territory. Precipitation, more or less the reverse of this, but with a wider plume of, and more than likely wet across Southern California to mid-Atlantic states, likely dry for the northern Great Lakes and the northern Rockies and the upper Missouri. Let's see how it projects out in the next 3-month period. Not much different. Let's flip back and forth, flip back and forth. As you get into the late winter, early spring, now we're starting to bring the dry anomaly into the Ohio. That's one we've seen before in the past, but that's not one they've been projecting as much for this particular season. But looking like, again, there will be cold air. Don't get me wrong, but right now, if you're to bet whether you're on the warm or cool side, the farther north you go, the more likely it is to have a warm anomaly based on the long-term relations with ENSO. Drought outlook, the projections are getting a little more expanded there for the Missouri River Basin of heading towards drought as we go into the forecast period, October through the end of January. Also looking at that dryness in the upper Great Lakes. Okay, that's a nice empty slide. What does that tell us? Let's wrap it up with a summary. Yep, no surprise, it's been warm, it's been dry. Dry recent weather has been better for many things and bad for very few things, fire being one of the few. Cooler weather's coming soon, nothing particularly cold. Evidence that the El Nino outlook is on track, both in terms of the progression of the strength of the indexes in the tropics, but also in terms of some of the early impacts, including the active hurricane season in the Pacific and the moisture coming on shore. Southern California is on track to have had a very wet September and now October already. Just southern, although this current storm is heading farther up into the central Sierra. Pretty light on the summary there, but you know where to go to get more information. These slides are always available for you to go back and refer to at any time. Your favorite links, your favorite sources, your favorite people. Thank you very much. I didn't even put my name on there, so hopefully you won't track me down after today. I'm just joking. Thank you. I'm ready to hand it back to you, John.
Well, thank you, Nolan, very much, and we know where you are. We will now open up the question and answer period. Please use *6 to unmute your line before asking your question. Then when you're finished speaking, please use *6 to mute your line. Please say your name and who you're with before asking your question, and we'll go ahead and open up the Q&A. It's a *6 to unmute.
Very convincing presentation, apparently.
Apparently.
John, this is Bryce Anderson. Can you hear me?
Sure can, Bryce. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Nolan, thank you for your comments this afternoon. You talked about the, and by the way, I'm with DTN Ag News in Omaha, and we did have a lot of rain there that you talked about for sure here not too long ago. What do you think about the prospect for the late fall and winter moisture helping some of those areas in Kansas out where you talked about it being so dry for the wheat growers putting in their crop this fall?
There's optimism. I mean, if there's anywhere in our region where the confidence in the El Nino relationships are pretty decent to go on, of course, it's the northern Rockies going dry, but also it's more likelihood of some of the southern storms flushing a little moisture up into the southern and central plains. So at this point, there's still quite a bit of optimism to see improvement in those areas in a perhaps timely fashion.
Now, so far, things haven't really opened up yet too much. Are you concerned about that at this point, or is it too early to to be too concerned about the fact that they haven't gotten a lot of moisture here recently?
It's when you're in agriculture, it's always a concern when you find yourself drier than you want to be, and you're planted and in the ground, or you're nervous about wanting to wait to plant until you're more confident moisture is coming. But again, well, I guess this next storm would have been one that we would have liked to have seen target Kansas and eastern Colorado, and it looks like it's not aiming that direction from the current prospects. Every storm you miss is you're a little deeper in the hole, because as you well know, and this is true the farther west you go in the Great Plains, you only get a few chances. You don't get regular chances, and midwinter moisture doesn't amount to much the farther west you go. So we'd really like to see something before, say, the first week of November. So there's still time, and the projections still point favorably in that direction, but we'll see.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bryce. Any other questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Hey, this is Doug Clark. I just wanted to add on to what Nolan was saying about it being a little bit too early to call it necessarily a bad fall or a really dry fall in Kansas yet. The implications or greatest impacts, if you will be are generally later in the winter time for El Nino. So we tend to see those things sort of turn on, if you will, as we head more and more into December, January, February, and even past that in some cases. These stronger events tend to have a sort of later impact, if you will. Not to say that they can't now, but they tend to have a bigger impact the further into the winter we go. Let's leave it at that.
And that's definitely true regionally, or over much of the region. For parts of Colorado and West Kansas, we do have a little better fall relationship than a lot of other places.
We just had a question from Brian Rydland. He said, how do you see the El Nino ending? Will it be a fast transition or a nice, slow, gradual one towards baseline or a La Nina?
Great question. And when you look at those graphs and those forecast plumes, they all look like they're plummeting. And in fact, strong El Niños do drop off fairly quickly, almost in most cases, but they drop off to still pretty moderate El Nino type conditions. Even if we fell from a 2.5 degree anomaly to a 1 degree anomaly, that's still El Nino and still points us towards some of the other impacts we're expecting. I'm not expecting a total collapse on this one. I'm seeing a little buzz in the weather community that this may just be a fast collapse, fast and early collapse. I wouldn't bet on that.
I wouldn't bet on it either, Nolan. What I would say though is there certainly have been strong El Niños that have not only collapsed but switched over to La Nina within a 3 to 6 month period. Now those are relatively rare, but they're not unheard of.
Agree.
And we have a couple more questions. First from Benjamin Diamond. How does El Nino impact Midwest crop yields over the summer?
Can you tell who our Midwest experts who might be on the call are? Because I would defer that to a Midwest ag climate expert.
Let's give Nolan for us if Jim Angel wants to talk to that one, or if he's on or not.
Jim's not
Otherwise,
on right now.
He's not on. Okay. So the generalization about El Nino is that it's relatively benign, relatively benign for the Midwest. Not necessarily true in other areas. Again, better chances for above normal temperatures, so sometimes not always great for agriculture performance. Things are sort of looking for strength.
Doug, we can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
Sounds like we have somebody driving and
Yeah, it sounds like a drive-by there. Anyway, unless someone else wants to comment on that issue, I'd say generally it's relatively benign, and this year we saw relatively decent crops in most areas. That helps.
okay. And Paul Lepisto, or I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. It's still very early, but do you have any predictions for mountain snowpack in the upper Missouri River Basin for the winter and what that may mean for system runoff in 2016? And I'd like to ask everyone, once you have asked your question, please *6 to mute your line. Thank you.
Yes. Well, let's see. Do I have a graphic I can quick go back to, or have I given up?
Well, Nolan, you could talk a little bit about the drought outlook, kind of.
Yeah, can you see that drought outlook? Yeah, there it comes.
Yes, sir.
You'll see a fair piece of the upper Missouri in areas called drought development likely. And that is based on, let's go back to there we go, that's the November-January expected rain, likelihoods of temperature and precipitation departures, and showing the greater likelihood of being on the dry side for the northern Rockies and on the wet side for the southern Rockies, and that's for the November through January time period. It relaxes a little bit, but is still more in that direction for the February through April time period. But overall, the reason why you're seeing these, the tendency or the projection of drought development likely, is due to distinctly tilted odds towards higher likelihood as being dry in the northern Rockies for this coming winter, starting right out of the box. And of course, we already have dry anomalies in place in those areas as we go into this new year.
And thank you. And Laura Edwards asks, in response to the El Nino and crop question, the U2U project has a climate patterns viewer tool that looks at ENSO pattern and corn yields. Generally, El Nino is favorable for northern corn belt. It's at agclimate4u, number 4, and the letter u.org is the website. Any other questions?
Hi, John. This is Diane Manklager with BIA. I was just wondering if the historic El Niños that have happened, do they have high wind events like we had on Sunday?
I am qualified to answer that as it applies to Colorado, southern Wyoming. I am less qualified for the northern plains. But for our area, we tend to be in more of an upper level split flow pattern, and with relatively few, again, relatively, there will always be exceptions, relatively few strong cyclogenesis situations coming out of the Oklahoma Panhandle area. We see as such, reduced winds with a pretty decent statistical correlation for the eastern Wyoming, eastern Colorado, West Kansas, West Nebraska area. I am out of my comfort zone to know whether that expands and can be extrapolated to the northern plains.
Nolan, I think that's a pretty good bet to extrapolate it a little bit further out. So I'm not sure it's going to help you like you did, what was it, a week ago or a few days ago, where you had a huge windstorm and a lot of fires. But I think Nolan's right. The frequency of high wind events tend to be a little lower during an El Nino versus a La Nina event for sure.
Right.
Very good. Any other questions? Well, thank you for joining us today for the monthly Central U.S. Climate Outlook. We'd like to extend an invitation for you to join us for our next webinar, and that will be on November 19th, same time. Till then, for Nolan Doskin and our panelists today, have a good day. Bye-bye.